Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. My name is Bobo Lowe. I know you've had a long conference. I hope it's been a very productive conference. This should be a bit of fun at the end of a long 2 days. It's my honor to moderate what I think will be a thoroughly entertaining and I hope instructive debate on one of the most critical issues of today, namely China and its impact on the liberal international order. Now, to debate this subject, we have two distinguished teams who will debate either side of the question. The question is China a threat to the liberal international order? On one side, we have Olin Wethington and Theresa Fallon. Olin is Senior Fellow at the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council and a former Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the US Department of Treasury. Theresa is the Director of the Center for Russia, Europe, and Asia Studies in Brussels. Now, Olin and Theresa will argue that China does pose a threat to the liberal international order. Jacek, Bartosiak, and Hugh will take the opposite view. Jacek is Director of the Wargaming and Simulations Program at the Casimir Pulaski Foundation. Hugh, here, is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University in Canberra, and I don't want him to blush too much, but one of Australia's leading intellectuals. Let me start by saying a few words about the theme and format of today's debate. You will see that the debate question is pretty open-ended and may in fact be interpreted in a number of ways. So please let me share with you how I see, as an individual, how I see the debate question. My take on the question is as follows. Is China the primary threat to the liberal international order, or do the main dangers to the liberal international order come from elsewhere? So, if one believes that China poses an existential threat to the liberal international order, then you might vote yes in response to the debate question. If, however, you think that the main threat to the liberal international order comes from another country, say Russia, for example, or from the behavior of leading Western powers, such as the United States, or even the actions of particular individuals, such as Donald Trump, then if you thought those were the real problems, then you might consider voting no to the debate question. I must emphasize, however, that it is entirely up to you in the audience how you interpret the question, and obviously how you come to your decision. Now, a couple of points on the format. You in the audience will have the opportunity to vote twice on the debate question. Once before the debate, and then after the debate. The winner of the debate will be the team that benefits from the swing between the first and the second votes. In other words, the winning team isn't the team that gets the most votes, but will be the one that shows the greatest improvement as decided by you in the audience. Now, if the swing is very close, then the results of the debate may be adjudged a draw. So, I want to ask you at this stage to raise your hands for the first vote. If you think that China poses a threat to the liberal international order, would you please raise your hands? No, we're not going to do that. That'll come up in the debate itself. Don't be troublesome. So raise your hands, please. Maybe about, I would say, 35%, probably. Okay, if you feel that China does not pose a threat to the liberal international order according to your interpretation, would you please raise your hands? Ooh, slightly less, I'd say, maybe 35-30 with some don't knows. I'm going to call it 35-30. Okay. Olin, the floor is yours. Your 5 minutes. Does it work? Yep. Does it? Yeah, I think it's good.
Thank you, and I'm very glad to be here. This has been a terrific, terrific conference, and I'm very pleased to have been part of it. I congratulate Kasia and the organizers. Thank you. Yes, I am for the motion that China is the primary threat to the liberal international order. It is a long-term, global, comprehensive, strategic rival. Other potential rivals, though of grave concern, are essentially, in my view, regional threats with limited reach. The dysfunction, the polarization in Western democracies does not, in my view, eliminate the reality of the China threat. The core of China's strength has been its outsized and unprecedented economic growth, providing wealth to enable rapid military buildup, indigenous development of advanced technologies, deployment of offshore capital, and the building of deep trade relationships, all of which enable the offshore projection, I should say, of influence and power. But to understand the threat, we must first quickly ask ourselves, what does China want? What are its rulers' strategic objectives? Most fundamentally, in my view, the Chinese Communist Party seeks to preserve its domestic power. But beyond that, China seeks to restore its historic status as the predominant power in Asia. And ultimately, China seeks to become a global actor with capabilities and influence on a par with, if not eventually superior to, the United States and its closest allies. China wishes to reshape the existing order and to write the rules of a more accommodating new order, with the United States and its allies weakened, divided, intimidated, or pushed to the periphery. Xi Jinping refers to this strategic objective as national rejuvenation, and this requires, in China's view, the development of so-called comprehensive national power. So, more specifically, what threats does China pose to the liberal international order? It is multidimensional. But for starters, I will mention only three, and Theresa will pick up where I leave off. First, in the military realm, China continues to spend heavily on military modernization, double-digit increases over the past decade. Witness also the National Day Parade 2 days ago. China is capable today of fighting and winning local wars, and its reach is now well beyond its periphery. Ballistic missile and anti-ship capacity, naval, maritime, and offensive air capability, long-distance mobility operations, space, anti-satellite, and offensive cyber capabilities. It aligns its civil and military technology development. It is investing heavily in emerging technologies, cyber and AI applications. Its tactics include military intimidation of neighbors and demonstration of its global reach. Witness, i.e., joint Russia-China military exercises in the Baltic Sea. Second, China has prioritized technology advantage as the driver of future strength. Acquire it, force its transfer, steal it, and at the same time pursue self-reliance in critical technologies through massive state subsidies, regulatory advantage, and market protection. Whoever controls the commanding heights of advanced technology, particularly in communications networks, AI, and computing, dominates future economic activity and
30
writes the
seconds,
rules
Olin.
of the new order. Third,
30 seconds.
30 seconds. China poses an existential threat to liberal values. It offers an alternative model demonstrating that economic prosperity and authoritarian governance can coexist. Thus, in conclusion, very quickly, the liberal order must, in my view, awake and urgently and collectively develop a strategic and operational response. Thank you.
Olin, can you clarify something for me, please? At one stage, you say China wants to reshape the existing order, which suggests that it's happy to maintain the existing order but wants to reform it in a way to reflect China's greater status and influence. But then you go on to say China wants to develop a new world order. So what is it? Remaking the existing order or creating a new world order, and on what basis?
China has obviously benefited tremendously from the existing order. Our openness, our transparency have enabled its economic rise. But China does not find that satisfying for its long-term objectives. If it is to achieve preponderance in Asia, it must rewrite to some extent the rules of existing institutions. It must create at the same time new rules and institutions to further its strategic interest. That same condition applies on a global basis. China will continue to play within existing institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks, but at the same time it will also create its own where it has even larger influence. Witness the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
So it's in transition new institutions and new ambitions.
It will continue to play within the existing regime, the existing order to the extent it benefits, but it is looking well beyond that. It approaches it from a different set of values, a set of values which will accommodate long-term its authoritarian model of economic prosperity.
Okay, thank you, Olin. Jacek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My argument is against the motion, and the reasoning is following. It's not China that is the threat to the liberal world order. It is the rise of China that is a threat, or at least a challenge. And not is, but was, because it was already challenged, and it is already broken, and it's not with us anymore. And it's good to realize that we are already past this moment. There is no international world order anymore in place. And let me get back to my first argument, that it's not China, but it is the rise of China. It could also be the rise, for example, of Saudi Arabia, if this rise were big enough to challenge and create the situation, foundations for potential domination in Eurasia that always creates a sort of balancing act by the United States as a maritime power controlling the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, and the architect that was underpinning the global trading system and actually the security architecture of the world. So again, it is the rise of China, not China itself, because China rose within the system. And the world benefited from that, including the United States. And it was a prosperous and beautiful time of prosperity for everybody, including my country. But human nature cannot change the structural shift. And we are facing the structural shift triggered by, again, the rise of China, as it was before, by the rise of Germany, during Kaiser times and then another time. It was the rise of Soviet Union itself, and it repeats itself. Okay, we can ask the philosophers what's wrong with the human nature, that it is the rise that is changing the structure of relationship. But it's common for everybody, even in human relationships. And that's what we face today. And this rise was spectacular. So spectacular that it really broke the system. And now, of course, we can differ how we define the international world order. I defined it, in principle, in the following way. It was the freedom of strategic flows. United States created, again, a beautiful system where peoples and nations could prosper. Freedom of movement of people, of goods, of the capital, of innovation, of ideas, of internet, of ships, of everything. Mostly around the world ocean, the maritime highway. And this was the system created after the Second World War and then consolidated after the Soviet Union collapsed. And it was China that entered this system, and everybody benefited to a certain extent and to a certain moment. But the system broke down because of the rise of China, not China itself. And I will tell you more. Actually, it was the United States that at one point, and the people in the future will be debating what was exactly the moment of realization at the White House or at the Pentagon or wherever in DC, that United States decision makers realized that they need to descale globalization and impose frictions on the freedom of strategic flows to change the trajectory of the rise of China. Because China, again, rose within the system. So it's a paradox that this is the liberal leader of the world had to make this decision to impose frictions and blockades and sanctions just to create the new conditions for the sustained supremacy of the United States. And this is the new reality. The liberal world order, how I define it, it's gone. And this is my argument, at least for the beginning of our debate.
Okay, so, Jacek, just to follow up here. The problem, if I understand you correctly, is not the assertiveness or even the ambition of China. It's more actually the failings, the shortcomings of a declining West. So the liberal world order was already in decline, and there maybe was an emerging vacuum in which, say, a rising power like China, but it could have been some other rising power, naturally fell in. Is that a fair summation? That the problem is not China, the problem is actually a declining liberal world order?
No, I need to disagree again
Please.
with this proposition. I wouldn't blame anybody, actually. I would focus more on the structural shift.
What is a structural shift?
The primary reason...
How do you measure a structural shift?
Okay.
What do you understand by it?
Actually, there was no, at the same time, a powerful United States and powerful China on the planet Earth. As simple as that. And this is the first time that we're facing it. Look at the history of Chinese in the 19th century and the 20th century. So we are facing a completely new strategic landscape by manifold more difficult than it was with Germans or
Sure.
Soviet Union.
Okay.
And it would be good if we sober up and come to realization that it's not about words and values, but it's resources, means how to do it, think through and create a new order if the West is to survive with the values. So we need to reverse the debate. Less about the values, more of resources, concrete steps, advancement of technology, real thinking, hard power politics,
objective realities.
Objective realities,
Okay.
and we're back to the history.
Theresa, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. I understand I will make my opening remarks and then we will respond to the other side's comments. Last night at dinner, the historian Howard Davies made a point about how important it is to use correct names of things. For example, using the term Russia or the Soviet Union. So I will argue we aren't talking about China at all here. We're talking about the People's Republic of China, which is a one-party system run by the Chinese Communist Party. So I think if we made the statement, you might have a very different perception if I said, yes, I am for the motion that the Chinese Communist Party is a threat to the international liberal order.
Okay.
I have 3 points. Firstly, Xi Jinping has a vision for transforming global governance. He has laid this out. It's very opaque to the rest of us, but it's already discussed in China. For example, lawfare. We need rule of law, don't we? 93% of world trade is by the sea. And the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, China was there, or the PRC, I should say, was at the table. They were there negotiating it. They're signatories to it. Yet they reinterpret it the way they want. So this is weakening the rule of law and the international fabric that's so important for everyone's prosperity. So they want to have a different set of rules for their near seas and a different set of rules for their far seas. But if Russia tries to do this, say for in the Arctic, the PRC will be very uncomfortable with that position. So they're like, do as we say, but not as we do. And we know that this will lead to a lot of conflict and friction. They've also reneged on a promise to the US president not to militarize the South China Sea. So we see a lot of increased tensions in a region where most of world trade takes place. So this will have a direct impact on Europe's economies. In addition, the Chinese Communist Party has an aspirational text called Document Number 9, which was leaked. And it sees that what they call Western values are a threat to them, like constitutional democracy, freedom of the press, and judicial independence. Things I think everyone in this room would agree is a very, very important thing to uphold. The Chinese Communist Party has incarcerated more than 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang, has to try to destroy Tibetan culture. We watch helplessly as it destroys attempts at democracy in Hong Kong, as well as launches an interference campaign to weaken Taiwan's democracy. The Chinese Communist Party is an aggressive challenger to our systems and values. Second, economics. It didn't work out like Fukuyama, right? You know, it's the end of history, everything's gonna be great. We'll let China join the WTO and everything will be beautiful. They'll become a democracy and look a lot like us. That's not what happened. China joined the WTO in 2001 and became an increasingly powerful country and power. The idea of reciprocity, everyone thought, well, China will be great. We can do 1.4 billion people are in China, we'll have great business. It never really worked out that way. So the idea of reciprocity, market-oriented economic reform stops with the financial crisis of 2008. And we see China exporting a lot of this through the Belt and Road Initiative. So their excess capacity is being sent around this new initiative. And thirdly, technology. China has increased efforts to seize Western technology through cyber theft and has been very impressive. So now they're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants. The Chinese are very smart, they're very hardworking, and now they're innovating and improving technology. And they have some technology that even we in the West do not have. So they want to export this as well on the Belt and Road Initiative, the authoritarian surveillance system. Now they are also leaders in artificial intelligence, and they're using their vast pools of data to create a social credit score. So we might think, oh, those poor Chinese, they're all being judged. But actually, the social credit score is also being applied to businesses, including European businesses. So this is a form of coercion and leverage, and something very difficult for us. We're all involved in this, whether we like it or not.
30 seconds.
Okay, so we need to fight against this technological tyranny. So in closing, Pastor Martin Niemöller wrote about the Holocaust and the cowardly behavior of those who knew they would be protected, at least at first. I'd like to conclude my opening remarks by paraphrasing his thoughtful poem in regard to the Chinese Communist Party's incremental attack on the international liberal order, which they view as undermining their long-term interests. First, they came for the Uyghurs, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Uyghur. Then they came for the peaceful protesters in Hong Kong, then the first aiders, then the press. Again, I did not speak out. Then they looked at my social credit score, and came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me, because the few people left were afraid that their own social credit score would be lowered.
Okay. Thank you, Theresa. You raise a really interesting point that we're not really talking about China, we're talking about the People's Republic of China. And perhaps we can extend that and say we're talking about the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping, perhaps. But this raises an interesting issue, which is when we look at the United States, and we see Donald Trump, do we think the United States is Donald Trump? When the United States withdraws from the JCPOA, when it abrogates the Paris Climate Change Agreement, withdraws from the INF Treaty, can we not make a parallel that, in a sense, it is not just China, but the United States, but Russia, but all these other countries that are basically saying, rule of law? What rule of law? Who makes the rules?
So who makes the rules? This is the Oxford debate. So my position is to discuss, is China a threat to the international liberal order? So those are my 3 points: economics,
but do you not
global
think
governance, and the rule of law. So I think that these are the key issues that, as a debater, that's what I'm focusing on.
But you identify the rule of law as critical. Some people would say there's a general breakdown of the rule of law in the international arena. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, my points are global governance. Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he's against the current order of global governance. My second point is that the economy, China is not an open playing field. It's not open for others to invest. There's been no reciprocity, so there's no kind of recognizing the World Trade Organization. And lastly, technology. They've really stolen through cyber theft and have taken and abused Western innovation.
Fair enough. Hugh.
Thank you, Bobo, and it's a great pleasure to be here and take part in this debate on what is a pretty important issue. So I'm arguing no, China doesn't threaten the liberal international order because you can't threaten what doesn't exist. The liberal international order, the idea that's in our minds when we use that phrase, a beautiful idea, a beautiful dream, it never existed. And at the risk of sounding like a lapsed philosopher, you can't challenge what doesn't exist. That dream dates back to the 1990s, that magical period at the end of the Cold War, when we had a vision of international order led by America that was the new Rome. Remember the phrase, the new Rome? The idea of America that was unchallengeably preponderant in every dimension of national power, economic, technological, military, and moral, and that it was committed to use that power to sustain a vision of the world based on free markets, free trade, functioning democracies that delivered good, disciplined, workable governments, and peace between countries. And the really exciting thing about that vision was that it was shared, at least we thought it was shared, by every major power, not just Europe and Japan, but China and Russia. And in that world, there was no strategic rivalry between major powers. And even the weaker powers, even the countries like the Middle East, there was hope that they would be drawn into this vision of global order. And because there'd be no major power rivalry, there'd be no geopolitics, the risks of conventional conflict would be low. Our countries would be called upon only to deal with relatively minor strategic challenges, the new security threats that we used to talk about. And the threat of nuclear war, particularly nuclear war between major powers, would dwindle almost to nothing. It never happened. That was never a description of the world that we found ourselves in the 1990s. I wish it had been. That vision of the world was one that would have suited my country well, certainly would have suited Poland well, would have suited everybody well. But it didn't happen because it transpired that actually America wasn't globally preponderant in every dimension of power. Just to take one, its economy, though very vigorous and very impressive, was already being steadily overtaken by a China that was achieving a phenomenon of economic growth the like the world had ever seen. And that's trends continuing. We can't begin to understand what we're facing in the world today unless we acknowledge that China's economy is already bigger than America's and will, in all probability, keep growing faster than America's. It's the biggest and fastest and most fundamental change in the distribution of wealth and therefore of power in human history. What's more, China, and for that matter Russia, didn't accept America's vision, the vision that we, so many of the rest of us, subscribe to of the future of global order. And China in particular is significantly challenging the vision of regional order that the United States had upheld in Asia for so long. And that challenge is backed by a very significant military challenge. The United States turned out not to be as preponderant militarily as we'd all thought. In fact, it transpires that there is no guarantee that the United States can achieve the strategic objectives it needs to achieve to defend that vision at a cost and risk that the United States is willing to pay or that its allies are willing to pay. Indeed, as the contest from China intensifies, there's a growing risk of conflict in Asia as China challenges the United States leadership and uses the instruments of military power to do that, and America uses the instruments of military power to push back. We've all read the book, the Thucydides book, so we all know that war's not inevitable. But we also should know, if we read that book carefully, that it's a very serious risk. And particularly it's a serious risk because nuclear weapons are back in the picture.
30 seconds.
And there's a real risk that we're going to find ourselves facing a nuclear confrontation. So what's our job? It's not to try and chase that old dream. It's to build a new global order and a new order in Asia, which doesn't try and deny China's power, but accommodates it. Accommodating China is going to be terribly hard, but it's going to be better than the alternative, because the alternative leads us down a very dark path indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. I understand your point about the liberal illusions about this happy-clappy, geopolitics-free post-Cold War order. But I do wonder whether the Chinese approach, was quite nakedly cynical. Well, maybe not transparent for a while, but has become clear now. And that essentially what's happened over the last 30 years is that China has gained the liberal world order, or what passed for the liberal world order. So how does one respond to that? Now, you say build a new global order, but that raises the question of build a new global order on what basis? On the basis of what values, what norms, what institutions?
Yeah, no, really important question. So what did China do? I think it did something perfectly natural. I don't say it's admirable. I'm not saying I'm glad they did it, but no one should be surprised that as China's power grew, it sought to restore the position in Asia which it sees itself as having had traditionally. When Mao Zedong did the deal with Nixon in return for America recognizing the Chinese Communist Party as the government of China, China recognized America as the primary power in Asia and ceased to contest its position there. That laid the foundation for decades of growth in Asia and China's opportunity. But it was always the case, as Deng Xiaoping's famous phrase said, bide your time and hide your power. Yeah. That says it all. We bide our time until the time comes. And so it was always, it seemed to be very unwise for us to imagine that China would somehow, as its power grew to approach and overtake the United States, it would accept the position of subordination to US strategic primacy in China's own neighbourhood, which it had accepted in 1972. If so, it gained it. It was a tactical, short-term, you might say cynical decision, sure, but this is statecraft, and it worked.
So if Deng had stayed in power, do you think he would have done exactly the same as Xi Jinping?
Yes, I think any Chinese leader, at the point at which they believed China was strong enough for its challenge to be effectively irresistible, they would have started to challenge. Okay. Xi Jinping has, of course, his own take on it, and he's a very potent leader, but I think it would have happened with any leader. So what's the basis on which we build a new order?
Yep.
I'm going to sound a bit Machiavellian here. We don't build a new order on the basis of values. We build a new order on a basis of a realistic understanding of the distribution of wealth and power and the measures that are required to establish stability, first and foremost. In a world with nuclear weapons, and we still live in a world with nuclear weapons, strategic stability is the number one priority. Peace is a value too, if I can put it that way.
Okay. Well, thank you. We have 24 minutes left. I'm going to take a whole series of questions and interventions, probably in 2 rounds. Please introduce yourself, and please keep your questions and interventions short and snappy. Who would like to start? Sir. Over here. Yeah, it's coming. It's coming behind you. Yeah.
Great, okay, thank you very much. So I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Wilfried Martin Center for European Studies in Brussels. My question is to Olin Wethington. Now, I'm assuming, contrary to the other side, that the global liberal order still exists in some form. But how can it be defended in a concerted and coherent effort by the West if the US government, if the US government considers the European Union a foe, quite officially, wages a trade war not only against China but also against Europe, and itself does everything to weaken the global international liberal order, for example, in the WTO?
Okay, next. Anyone? No questions? No interventions? All right, well, why don't you answer that question then?
Yes, very important question. I'll give you my personal response to that. I don't reflect the positions necessarily of the U.S. administration. But I think in many ways, fundamentally, our response to the China challenge starts at home. And that we must demonstrate, by we I mean not only the United States, but also the other advanced democracies, that our system of governance, a democratic system that respects rule of law and individual liberty, can deliver for its people. That proposition is now in doubt in some quarters, but I think it's essential that our response, which needs to be long-term to China, sees that as a fundamental prerequisite. The second dimension I would emphasize is relationship, strong relationship with our allies and key partners. We need, through effective statecraft, to forge, through dialogue, a common approach. And this applies to many areas of our interaction with China. I think also the necessity exists for building and extending existing institutions. We should be seeking new arrangements that put in place new rules of the game in trade and investment and in technology transfer. We should do that in conjunction with our allies, and we should leave a seat at the table long term for China to join those arrangements. I think further, the world has changed. There has been a shift in power, and the US and its closest allies must recognize that reality within the governance of existing institutions. We must find ways within existing framework to make these institutions responsive to a much broader constituency. So those would be my starting points. Thank you.
Theresa, you want to pick up on?
To pick up on your point, you agree with me, because you're kind of saying that China broke the international liberal order because they could not be integrated into it. So thank you for picking up on my point. So I'm a student of John Mearsheimer, and he looked at 1989 to 2014. He calls it the unipolar moment, and China broke the system. So yes, the PRC broke the system. Yes, they broke the international liberal order. The title might be a couple years old, but it's 2014 would be the date that John Mearsheimer would put it. So how do we hang these other institutions, the UN, the WTO, EU, NATO? They're still around, even though we say the ILO is, the international liberal order doesn't exist. But these institutions, which were born out of the ashes of war, exist. So how does that fit into your argument. It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, I want to ask, just building on those questions here. Olin, you highlight three areas in response to that question. You say we must show that our system is better than theirs, we must maintain effective alliances, and we must develop sort of appropriate rules and safeguards. Now, a cynic might say that the first two of those three reasons are about improving ourselves. So it's less about the rise or the threat of China, and it's more about fixing our own weaknesses. So have we got the argument, arguably the wrong way round? I mean, there are various dimensions to the argument, but I just wanted to push you on that, if I may.
Well, I think to some extent there is at least a logical inconsistency, and you do point it out. But I think the beginning at home point cannot be escaped, and it enters into on the values dimension of our confrontation, of our engagement with China. Because I think we are fundamentally talking about two different systems of values. We make the assumption that the core values of a state influence its inclination toward conflict and toward war. And we make an assumption that democratic states that respect rule of law, that replace leaders through a popular democratic process, are less inclined to conflict. So this is an integral part of our strategy. Okay. Should be.
Theresa, you mentioned about post-Cold War, post-World War II institutions. Do you see them, in spite of the China challenge, as fundamentally healthy still, and therefore very much live institutions that we can continue to build on?
For example, China accessed to the World Trade Organization in 2001, but it failed to adopt open market-oriented policies, which they signed up to. So in line with its accession commitment. So they really broke the system by not following the rules, and they benefited greatly. In Brussels, they had a big gala event at the Beaux-Arts Theatre, and they had a film of all the great things that happened to the PRC. And one of them was their aircraft carrier. The second was joining the WTO. So they acknowledged themselves that they wouldn't be where they are today if they hadn't used these systems. And then they broke it. And now we're in a really, I think we should still invite them to come back and to work within the system. I think the invitation's still there, but I think unless we're entering, a new period of great power competition, which I think it looks that way.
But let's take the point that, okay, so China broken the system. So is the system broken and therefore we need to develop a new global system, or is the system of international institutions still up? I accept what you're saying about China having broken the WTO, but then that sort of suggests that whoever's fault it is, maybe we need a new system. What do you say to that?
But the debate is about, is China a threat to the liberal international order? And I would argue that because they have not kept their promises, they've abused the system, and that's what the problem is in this debate.
Fine. Zach. And then you, and then you. Right. Just here. Sorry.
Thanks very much. Zach Pakin, University of Kent. My question is to the side that's arguing in favor of the motion, and I'll just note that this idea that democracies are inherently peaceful and China's not gone to war with anybody in 40 years. The U.S. dropped bombs on 7 different countries last year. But that aside, my question has to do with your argument on institutions. The argument was brought forward that China is designing its own institutions, and therefore that is somehow a threat to the liberal international order. But isn't the liberal international order fundamentally rooted in institutions? Can China not be seen to be increasing the degree of multilateral cooperation that exists in the world? Should we not confuse, per se, on the one hand, the liberal international order, and on the other hand, this idea that there is a certain distribution of power or American preeminence at a given time?
Okay. So.
Thank you very much, Patrick Kugel, Polish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. But I think it would have been even more fascinating if you started by defining clearly what you understand by liberal international order.
Sure.
Because if you understand this as a US-led or Western-led international order, then simply, clearly, China is a major threat. But if you define liberal international order as rules-based international order based on multilateralism with central role of United Nations and WTO, then, according to many American scholars like John Eichenberry or Joseph Nye, the major threat comes from Donald Trump and from the US under its leadership. So,
so you make a clear distinction between a US-led world order and a liberal, rules-based
it's
world
very
order.
important to know what we are discussing about in the first place. Thank you.
Hello, Lolita Hassani from New Security Leaders Program. I have two connected questions. Well, how can China be a threat when all Chinese papers say that its objective is promotion of multilateralism and equal global powers in the world? And second, is it maybe the Chinese rapid economic growth that make the rest of us feel less self-confident and see Chinese growth as a threat to us? Thank you.
And Kasia, the last one for this round, and then we'll do one more round.
But I do have to say that, Hugh, we had that discussion in Canberra, and I really respect your and Jacek's work, but I think what you're proposing instead is what we've already known, going back to the past, and it was called in this part of the world the Alta. So yes, we can neatly, in your vision, divide the world in spheres of influence, but somebody's going to fall in one sphere and the other, not knowingly and not willingly in another. So what are you going to do with Hong Kong, Taiwan, Ukraine, and many other places that unwillingly will have to be on the other side of the curtain of this neatly world order that you're going to create? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, pursuing Kasia's point, I mean, are you advocating just sliding into a barren, geopolitic, values-free world?
I'm advocating sliding into that if the alternative is escalating strategic rivalry between immensely powerful states with large nuclear arsenals. Right. Because, of course, I don't like the idea of Taiwan's democracy being snuffed out by the Chinese Communist Party. I think I dislike that as much as anybody else. Except I maybe dislike the alternative more. Because a war between the US and China over Taiwan is a war that the United States cannot win, and if it did win, it would, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, be a victory that was indistinguishable from defeat. Now, I put a very high premium on preserving the peace. That means accommodation, and accommodation has victims. It's a very...
Okay. Jacek, do you want to pick up the point about what kind of world order we're talking about, or indeed any world order? Yeah.
That's an excellent observation and a question. Yes, what is this definition of this liberal world order? Actually, the order. And again, let me rephrase it. It was fascinating to see a very rare event, maybe a unique one. Freedom of strategic flows. This is how I define it. We could move wherever we wanted, we could sell, and the Americans were holding on their shoulders the gravity of geopolitics by their US Navy, security, world ocean as the maritime highway, the edge and technology, controlling the geostrategic corridors where the strategic flows traverse, and the superb military power. And it was a liberal hegemon, democratic hegemon, private ownership hegemon, and a lot of other values that go attached, with the power. In this case, the sea power of the United States. It was a bliss for my country. It was a bliss for other countries being closer to the great continental powers in Eurasia. But one thing is my wishful thinking, and another thing is reality. Right now, we are already in the chapter called reality. And this is what Hugh White is clearly saying. And we need to grasp it, because otherwise we will end up even in a graver situation. And one more last point. So it's all about freedom of strategic flows. And China was very happy about it, because China, by its sheer size and productivity and laboriousness of people, simply made a lot of money out of it. Okay. And it was the United States that decided to curtail it.
Okay. I'll come back to you guys in a moment. Where were you? Sorry.
Ella,
Yes.
thank you. Ella Ascarov from the Fletcher School, Tufts University. Theresa, my question to you, and thank you for being the only woman on the stage. So my question is, there are more than 2 million people in re-educational camps in Xinjiang province, not only Uyghurs, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, even children. What can we do to stop this human rights abuse? Thank you.
Okay. Lady here.
Thank you. I would like to echo our speaker. Yes, China, as I think the reason we gather here is because we see the emerging number one economy, China's rising, as Mr. Bartosiak has mentioned. And actually, China did and has benefited from the current order, world order led by US. And in terms of security, actually China has actively contributed also in UN peacekeeping force in various regions together with US. But in terms of economic policy, as Mr. Deng Xiaoping, the godfather of China's opening up and reform policy has mentioned, China has to proceed with the reform by touching the stone. So it's really like China will always go the Chinese way.
So you don't think that China is actually just got a purposeful vision of what it wants? It's just sort of experimenting and improvising? Is that what you're saying?
I would say it's the evolution of the Chinese development. It's a new model of development. And if we see that China actually has benefited enormously from the World Bank system. So in order to share the success, China also created AIIB and also initiated this Belt and Road Initiative. We want to more regions and more countries, more underdeveloped regions to also benefit this development model.
Okay, pass the microphone over there.
Jacek from Estonia. Very direct question to the no camp. So just to make sure, you are happy with a world order where a country can put 1 million or 2 million people in concentration camps because of Machiavellian reasons? Are you happy with that? Is that a world worth living? Secondly,
don't have to answer that straight away.
Secondly,
yes.
Secondly, was, in your opinion, no camp, the Second World War worth fighting?
All right, I'm going to go over here. The gentleman there. Yep.
My name is Ridvan Bariur Costa.
Bit louder. Louder.
My name is Ridvan Bariur Costa. I am from University of Warsaw. Last 3 years, I'm dealing with grand strategy of the Soviet Union towards the third world, actually, Middle East. So the answer, in my perspective, that we need to go a bit to Cold War history. Cold War history. What was the Soviet Union was doing during the Cold War?
What's your
intervention?
Yeah.
So Soviet Union was creating alternative order. Actually, it's failed, yes, but Soviet Union was creating alternative order. If we understand that the world revolution when failed, so they turned it to the third world, and the Soviet Union was supporting third world. I would call right now, it's not only about China, it's not about Russia, it's a revolt of third world against Western domination during the history. What's going on right now? And even right now, one of the multipolarity concept was provided by Primakov, so we should take into account this concept. It's not only about China, and it's more.
The gentleman there in front here.
Eugeniusz Chmiczuk, the Center of Analysis of the Egilonian Club. So there is a question predominantly directed to Dr. Bartosiak. Don't you think that actually China had broken the international world order in the moment when it actually started to profit so much for it, when it started to cheat on the system?
Yeah, all right. The lady in the third row there. Yep, you.
Anna Dombek, I'm from Pulaski Foundation organizing this conference. So I want to say that why is everybody so shocked that China wants to be, like, say, number one?
Sure.
What's the name of China? It's Zhongguo. So it's the middle country, the center, the middle kingdom. So why is everybody so shocked that China wants to be in a leading position?
So you see that China is, in a sense, fulfilling its historical mission
Exactly,
of
they're
being the
coming
center
back.
of the universe.
Exactly,
Is that
they're coming
all right?
back. They're coming back
Okay.
from the very first beginning. When they said that it was like 天下, so it was everything like below the 天, so the heaven, the God. So Chinese people, they always fought that they are in the center and they are the most important, let's say. And I do agree with them.
Well, that sounds like a threat to the liberal international order, if ever there was one, really. The gentleman in front here. So.
Thank you. General Jacek, Chief of Defense, Polish Armed Forces. So let's put a little bit military flavor on it. It sounds for me there's definitely kind of a confrontation. Even you sitting in a little bit, facing each other.
I didn't do the seating plan,
if
really.
if there's a confrontation of civilization, confrontation of the values, economy, and military power as well, do we have a clear picture who we confront? From one side, we have China, which will be relatively easy for everybody here to describe in a geographical location. And the other side was mentioned is a liberal world. So I don't know exactly who is fighting with whom. And do we have, if any, criteria of victory in this confrontation? And the Sun Tzu is the very important man who said that the highest level of victory will be just winning without a fight.
Exactly.
Is it possible today in this kind of a confrontation or not? Thank you.
All right, we have two people just very quickly, one in the front, one in the back.
Hi, my name is Kevin Vong. I'm one of the new security leaders from Canada. My question is for the against motion, or team. When I reflect on this motion, I think about what the future holds. And what's undeniable about the future is it's going to be increasingly technology and AI driven. And so to use AI as we look to the future and try to answer this question, there's two schools of thought. One that's driven by predominantly the US, that's consumerism driven. The second, that's China driven. Theresa described it as social coercion. I could euphemistically describe it as social engineering, to restrict freedoms, to restrict the very values that I think are foundational to the liberal order. So how can you say that China is not a threat to that?
Okay, final one, guy at the back. Oh, sorry, you wanted, okay.
Grzegorz Lindenberg, European Issues Institute, Warsaw. My question is to Mr. Hugh.
Just a bit louder, please.
My question is to Mr. Hugh White. If China decides to invade Australia to secure its resources, would you advise America to give up on Australia to preserve the world peace, the way you advised America to give up on Taiwan?
That sounds like a rhetorical question, perhaps, but gentleman there.
And so much more. My point is very simple. What we have right now from the theoretical point of view, it's like a shift in the global balance of power from unipolar model to multipolar model or bipolar model. What it's not so bad. Multipolar model in 19th century assured the peace in Europe, yes. So maybe the problem is that it's rather United States who wanted to prevent this shift from the unipolar model to multipolar model can challenge the system and lead to the conflict.
Okay, final words from our speakers. Let's go, Olin, you first. Make the case. Why, in the face of all these excellent questions and interventions?
I hardly know which one to take, but this is sort of a closing comment.
Yeah, because we're short of time.
Despite my hawkish opening statement, let me add a couple of additional thoughts. Number one, I think the order that we have been calling the liberal international order is in fact much stronger than the discussion here today would lead us to believe. China, although it has position in Asia, although it has global power projection in a variety of dimensions, including military and economic, it has relatively few friends, even on its periphery. The position of the democratic countries within the liberal democratic order, our hand at this moment is much stronger. That to me is a source of great optimism. And we have in existence a variety of channels that enable us, if we have collectively the will to do it, to discuss what China means for the world going forward and to fashion a common strategy. And that includes the US, Europe, and friends in Asia, in particular, I would say, Japan. So I think to a great extent, we cannot diminish the threat that China poses because it does have tremendous military capability. It shows no sign of abating that. It shows no willingness to compromise in terms of the openness of its economy, or at least limited willingness to compromise. So I think to a great extent the future is in our hands, but that does not diminish the threat that China poses long term. So I simply leave this.
So the liberal international order is not broken, it's alive and kicking, but we need to nurture it.
It's under attack.
Yep.
It is under attack.
Okay, Theresa.
All right, there are so many questions. I'll just try to do this very quickly.
1 minute.
Europe described PRC as a systemic rival. We can't compete with the state-owned enterprises. And PRC is changing Europe more than we are changing them. Alstom and Siemens wanted to merge. Second, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Thank you for your question. I lowballed it because people, it's hard for them to even get their head around. It is 2 million people, and it's not just Uyghurs, it's Christians. We're finding anyone who disagrees with the government of the PRC, of the Chinese Communist Party, they end up in these camps. We've heard this before, haven't we? Do we want to live in this kind of world? And what are we going to do to prevent this from happening? Angela Merkel went to Beijing knowing this. She saw the satellite. She knew all of this. She knew about the South China Sea tension. She knew about Hong Kong, but she went and she signed. So here are my closing comments. I can see you there. I see you.
Yeah, no.
Okay, just one sec.
We're out of time.
Here it is, 1 sec. No. Final closing. To paraphrase Dag Hammarskjöld, the international liberal order was not created to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell. We've all been there. I need to close with this vote in mind. We need to fight for human rights, we need to fight for economic rights and an equal playing field, and we need to fight for digital privacy in an era of growing authoritarian surveillance and technological tyranny. The shifting tectonic plates of the geopolitical landscape, this is it, and the China challenge can create an opportunity for the US and Europe to work together, for we know that if we don't hang together, we will certainly hang separately. Thank you.
Okay, now, Jacek.
Okay, there have multiple questions, so a few quick answers. First of all, Eugenius, yes, was asking about who gamed the system. Yeah, but it was hubris. Everybody should have accepted that. How could anybody imagine that the Chinese would accept that they would be a cheap labor country? I mean, that was the deal, and they simply didn't want it, and it's obvious. Nobody would like to be a peripheria. And they simply don't want to be periphery anymore. And that's the case. They want to be at the peak of the division of labor. Poles would like to have the same, but there are not 1,400,000,000 people.
So the West deserved the rise of China?
I think that the world has not faced such a challenge of comparable scale at all. So there is no good answer. But this rise and the challenge it poses is of spectacular scale. And we cannot talk about values all the time because they don't create strategic flows. And nations live of strategic flows, of oil, of division of labor, of how they project power. And if the United States, and that's the case for how the United States is showing resolve, it's underperforming actually.
Sure.
And it's very bad for Poland. Allies closer in Eurasia to Russia and China are watching every day how credible the United States is, how it delivers, and it doesn't deliver. Actually, it doesn't deliver. You can't see power here of the United States that would be balancing, that would be still underpinning the liberal world order, however we call it. Yeah? And we feel threatened, and it's all about credibility. So United States would have to change its policy big time to create the situation, a setting for Taiwan, Japan, Australia, Philippines, Poland,
right.
to really believe that this order is to hold.
Hugh, the last word is yours.
Marvellous set of questions. Let me start with the General's question. What counts as winning? Terribly critical question. What are we really trying to achieve? It depends a bit how we conceive the contest, what the contest's about. All those things that Theresa mentioned are very important, but they're not the really fundamental things that we're on about. I think the really fundamental question here is which country ends up as the dominant military power, dominant strategic power in East Asia initially, and then perhaps eventually globally. Now, we'd all like to win that without fighting. The risk is that if I think I can win without fighting, and you think you can win without fighting, then we both step into the conflict and neither of us makes the compromises required. Yeah. So I think we do need to be willing to make some compromises and choices. Now, the gentleman up the back there asked how I'd feel about that as this applies to Australia. Thank you for the question, because I just published a book called How to Defend Australia, which addresses precisely that question, and I'm delighted and honoured to say it's being translated into Polish as we speak, literally. So it's an absolutely critical question. I do believe that each country has to examine its own predicament and ask itself, what can we do in a world in which the liberal international order is not working as we all hoped it would, to look after our own security? Some countries are a better place to do that than others. Every country has the opportunity, and I would say the responsibility, to sort out how best to approach it.
Sounds like a dog-eat-dog world. Is that what you have in mind?
Well, it's not the... let me come to the last question, because in the end it's the most important, and I'm very glad you asked it. I'm not happy with this world at all. As I said, I loved that vision of a liberal international order. I really did. I believed in it for a while. Couple of years, but well, they were nice years while they lasted. But the question is not, this is not a conversation about what we want. It's a conversation about what we should prudently expect. Yeah. And I think looking at, particularly from Asia, where I live, looking at Asia today, if our strategic objective, going back to the General's point, if our strategic objective is try to compel China to go back to accepting the US-led order, which has been foundation of Asian security for decades in the past, we will do nothing but drive ourselves into escalating strategic rivalry with a China that we cannot defeat and that we may well find ourselves in a war with. And we have no reason to believe that'll be a small war. It could easily be a nuclear war. So I don't like it. I like it better than the alternative. And of course, very important part of that is the last part of your question. Just give me 1 minute. Sorry. Do I think World War II was worth fighting? Yes, I do. But China, there's a lot about China I don't like, it's not Nazi Germany.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, time has come for the second vote. So if your answer is yes to the question, is China a threat to the liberal international order, will you put your hands up, please? Yeah, 35 to 40, 35%. Okay. If you don't think that China is a threat to the liberal international order, would you put your hands up? Gosh, it's pretty close. I think it's so close that I'm going to call it a draw with you. But I think what's most important is that I think our speakers have given us a great debate. Please join me in thanking Olin Wethington, Theresa, Fallon, Jacek, Bartosiak, and Hugh White.